Welcome to Sweet Onion Kitchen, and today we're doing a fun spin on banana bread. Obviously, our important ingredient is our bananas. We're going to spice those up with some nutmeg and cinnamon, and then of course, we have buttermilk, which is a little extra spin on banana bread, but I think it adds a lot of extra moisture and kind of makes for a richer, more fudgy banana bread. Our first ingredient that we're going to start with is butter. The important thing when you're baking with butter is you actually want to whip it up to make the crumb of your quick bread a little more airy. Typically, people use vegetable oil instead because that gives the same result, but I think butter adds a little bit of extra flavor, so that's why we're using this today. You want to whip your butter before you put in your brown sugar and your regular sugar because the sugars might weigh down the butter, so that's why we're going to whip it for a few minutes before we put those in. Now that we have our half a cup of butter whipped, we're going to add our brown sugar and regular sugar in equal parts. So let's start with our brown sugar. When scooping up your brown sugar, make sure to pack it in, not super tight, but to make sure you're not skimping on the brown sugar here. That was half a cup of brown sugar, so now we're going to add a half a cup of just regular granulated sugar. And now we mix. Now that our butter and sugar is mixed, we're going to add our spices and our vanilla extract. I like to add it in this step because if you're adding it with the flour, you risk the likelihood of your spices not being fully incorporated into the batter. So if we do this now, we don't have to worry about over mixing the flour, and we get a nice incorporated spice into our bread. We're going to start with half a tablespoon of cinnamon. Don't ever let a recipe tell you how much cinnamon to put in. You can put in as much as you want. And then 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. Don't worry if it's a little extra. No one's gonna notice. And finally, half a teaspoon of vanilla extract. You never want to make a sweet quick bread without vanilla extract. It just adds an extra oomph and it's super tasty. And now we mix. Now that we have our butter and sugar whipped together, we're gonna add our eggs one at a time. 1 egg. Oh, the sound it made. All right. We're going to just lightly incorporate that egg, and then we're going to add the second one. And egg number 2. Now that we're almost done with our wet ingredients, the last thing we need to do is mash our banana. For this recipe, you're going to need roughly 3 bananas, but like I said, don't ever let a recipe tell you how much to add. You want to make sure your bananas are nice and soft. The older they are, the better. I know they're kind of gross looking, but trust me, when you eat this banana bread, the waiting will be worth it. In terms of bananas, this is about roughly a cup, but sometimes with banana bread you can measure with your heart. And now we just mash. You can mash yours as chunky or as smooth as you like. I personally prefer my banana bread to be super smooth, so I just mashed it for a little longer. We want to make sure we add all of our wet ingredients together before we add our dry ingredients to make sure we don't over mix our flour. That's going to make our dough really tough, and it's just not going to be as tasty as I think we could get it. And now we mix. It's at this point I want to make sure to scrape down on the sides and the bottom of the bowl to make sure any butter or sugar that we missed earlier is going to be fully incorporated. And lastly, into our wet ingredients, we're going to add buttermilk. You can add any kind of fat you want. You can add sour cream, you can add regular milk. I personally prefer buttermilk because it adds a little nice extra tang, and I tend to think that it has a little more fat content, which just adds a little extra moisture to my bread.
Nice and thick.
Nice and thick. Now we're going to preheat our oven to 350 degrees. Now we're going to start on our dry ingredients. We're going to mix all of those together in a bowl first before adding them. We're going to start with 1½ cups of flour. When you're measuring your flour, it's important to fluff it up before putting it into the measuring cup. Otherwise, you risk putting in too much flour and you're just gonna get a really thick, dense, and dry bread. To our flour, we're gonna add 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 1½ teaspoons of baking powder. These are gonna help our bread become nice and fluffy. Finally, to this, we're gonna do ½ teaspoon of salt. I'm doing a little less salt because I use salted butter, which personally I think tastes better. If you're not using salted butter, just add an extra 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Good enough. We're gonna mix our dry ingredients together so they're a little more incorporated, so we have to do less mixing when the flour meets the wet ingredients. And finally, all we have to do is combine. I like to add half of our dry first, get that incorporated, and then we'll add the rest. All right, and now we're at the other half of our dry ingredients. When you're mixing flour, you want to do a slashing motion. It just agitates the flour less and keeps it from developing the gluten. So I have our greased loaf pan here. A little tip to make sure that the loaf comes out every time is once we've sprayed it, we're just gonna add a little bit of flour. We're gonna tap that around the inside of the loaf pan. You can also use sugar, but I find with the sweet bread, that just adds a little too much. Now that our loaf pan is greased and floured, we can go ahead and add our batter to it. And don't worry if your batter has little pockets of flour, it'll just bake out in the oven. So a tip to making sure your bread doesn't over-rise and then it cracks in the middle, I mean, it'll still be tasty, it just doesn't look as nice, is we're just gonna bang it against the countertop a few times. And now we bake at 350 for 55 minutes. Yay! Oh, look at that. The key to a good quick bread is to take it out 5 minutes before you think it's done, because it'll finish cooking while it's in the pan. Now the hardest part. We have to let it sit and cool. So after 20 minutes, we'll take it out of the pan. Now that our bread has been cooling for a little bit, we can take it out and slice into it. I love buttering and flouring my pans because the bread just slides out really easily, and then you're not fighting with it. So, let's cut into it. Ooh. It's nice and moist inside. It's still a little steamy. I can't help myself. I've got to try a piece. It's got great banana flavor in there. And it's crazy because you can't even taste the buttermilk. And I think it adds a nice bit of moisture. I hope you enjoyed this recipe, and I'll see you next time on Sweet Onion Kitchen.